2 decades, $2 trillion+, and a humiliating exit were the result of the US-Afghan war. Let's sneak peek into the timeline of how the Taliban undid 20 years of US efforts in just 20 days. Did you know that it was the longest war in United States history that continued for 19 years and 10 months, 5 months more than the Vietnam War? The Islamic militia group Taliban came into power in Afghanistan in 1995. They enforced Islamic law and created chaos through many public executions and amputations. Such extremism by the Taliban was criticized around the world. Not only that, the Taliban joined hands with al-Qaeda to take a stronghold in all parts of Afghanistan. As it became unbearable for the public to live under the Taliban rule, the local ethnic groups, HAMID, KARZAI, and MASOOD, joined hands to battle against the Taliban to regain control of the country. MASOOD's Northern Alliance forces in the north of Afghanistan and forces supported by HAMID KARZAI in the south led operations to capture Taliban-ruled areas. Later, in 1998, al-Qaeda bombed 2 American embassies in Africa. Following the attacks, President Clinton ordered missile attacks on bin Laden's whereabouts in Afghanistan. These attacks were in vain as bin Laden and his accomplishments, which included other al-Qaeda leaders, remained unharmed. Followed by the attack by al-Qaeda on American embassies, the UN Security Council declared al-Qaeda and the Taliban as terrorists. The UN Security Council imposed sanctions on their funding, travel, and arms shipments. Bin Laden was now at the top of the list of international terrorists. Bin Laden operated from Afghanistan and was training thousands of militants in training camps. On September 9, 2001, just 2 days before the 9/11 attacks, the commander of Northern Alliance, Ahmed Shah Massoud, was assassinated by al-Qaeda. He was a member of the anti-Taliban coalition. By killing Massoud, Laden provided the Taliban with what they desperately wanted. Laden was quite clever. He ensured protection from the Taliban in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, which had already been planned to commence 2 days later. On September 11, 2001, 4 commercial airliners were hijacked. 2 of them were crashed into the World Trade Center in New York, one at the Pentagon and one in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. This attack killed around 3,000 people. The most astonishing part of this attack was that even though al-Qaeda had its base in Afghanistan, none of those hijackers were Afghans. President Bush repeatedly asked the Taliban administration to hand over all the leaders of al-Qaeda to US authorities. Especially bin Laden was demanded as he was the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. Taliban straightaway denied handing over bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders. In October 2001, US and British militaries started airstrikes against locations in Afghanistan under Operation Enduring Freedom. American fighters began bombing sites affiliated with the al-Qaeda network and Taliban. This was the beginning of the 20-year war. Other UN member countries like Canada, Australia, Germany, and France also pledged future support in this war against terrorism. In November 2001, the Northern Alliance reached Kabul after weeks of fierce warfare with Taliban forces. Taliban fighters escaped southwest toward Kandahar. A month later in December, Taliban militants flee Kandahar, their last base in Afghanistan, as their paramilitary grip on the country breaks down. 2 days later, the final hold of the Taliban was taken over by US troops in the province of Zabul. This completely ended Taliban control in Afghanistan. It might seem that the war which the US started had come to an end, but that's not the case. The al-Qaeda troops were hiding in the mountains and the clashes were still going on. U.S. administration and Pentagon shifted their focus from Afghanistan to Iraq, which was considered a bigger threat in the war against terror. President Bush announced the reconstruction and gave about $38 billion in 8 years to Afghanistan for reconstruction and humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. Huge amounts of the taxpayers' money were just given away to an unstable country. All this money eventually made a specific group of Afghans ultra-rich. Most of them were initial interpreters for the U.S. Army when arrived in Afghanistan, and their loyalty was often the only criteria for receiving defense contracts. Contracts were given to local companies, intrigued mass corruption, and dismantled the democratic system. According to a Pentagon report, most of the billions of dollar aid given to Afghan contractors by the U.S. Defense Department went to the Taliban, the Haqqani network, and the corrupt Afghan authorities. Ryan Crocker, who served twice as a U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, considered these corruptions as the reason for America's failure. According to him, the U.S. administration flooded Afghanistan with billions of dollars for which they were incapable to handle. An interim government was formed, and HAMID KARZAI was appointed as the leader for the initial 6 months. In 2003, NATO takes control of ISAF forces in Afghanistan. ISAF forces increased in number from 5,000 to roughly 65,000 between 2003 and 2006. It included forces from 42 different nations, which included the 28 NATO member states. Later, in 2005, peaceful presidential elections were held, and Karzai won with a 55% majority. Karzai gives access to all the Afghan military facilities to U.S. forces to fight against extremism. ISAF took over leadership of international military forces in eastern Afghanistan from the U.S.-led coalition in 2006. In July 2006, violence increased and fierce combat erupted in South Afghanistan. The number of suicide bombers quadrupled and bombings doubled. This continued for almost 2 years. The local Afghan forces failed to control things. In 2009, President Obama announced a new strategy for the Afghanistan war. This policy included the deployment of more military personnel. A troop of 4,000 Marine soldiers was deployed to fight the growing Taliban insurgency in southern provinces. By the end of 2009, President Obama added an extra 30,000 troops to the Afghan war effort on top of the 68,000 previously deployed. In 2010, General Stanley McChrystal was dismissed from U.S. forces in Afghanistan for criticizing the U.S. administration. Later that year, NATO members nations signed a declaration committing to handing over complete security responsibility in Afghanistan to Afghan troops by the end of 2014. On May 1, 2011, Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda commander responsible for the 9/11 attacks, was killed by U.S. forces in Pakistan. At last, the person for which the whole Afghan war started was killed. But this reignited the long-running debate about whether or not to continue the war in Afghanistan. President Obama announced a drawback of 30,000 soldiers, whereas congressional members wanted a speedy evacuation of U.S. forces. But this wasn't the end of the war. The worst was about to come. In December 2011, countries meet at Bonn Conference in Germany. In exchange for sustained foreign support, Afghan President HAMID KARZAI demanded $10 billion per year for security and rebuilding for 10 years. Who doesn't love money, and when is it coming in bulk? KARZAI filled his pockets under the name of war and the support he provided to the U.S. administration. As the insurgency continues to flare, the conference remains inconclusive and fails to make a framework for Afghanistan transition to a self-sustaining and safe government. The US administration had fulfilled their goal of killing bin Laden, but now there was no reason to stay in Afghanistan. But that wasn't going to be easy. For 10 years, the US forces just spoon-fed the Afghans. Afghan forces had not been capable of operating on their own. After the death of bin Laden, the Taliban offered a deal to open an office in Qatar for peace talks. U.S. administration welcomed this move as they wanted a smooth transition and wanted to leave behind a stable Afghanistan. However, the Taliban suspended preliminary talks 2 months later. They accused U.S. administration of failing to follow through on promises of the prisoner swap. In February 2012, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announced the Pentagon's intention to end combat missions in Afghanistan by the middle of 2013 and transition to a primary security assistance role. Meanwhile, an unintentional burning of Qurans by U.S. forces killing 16 Afghan civilians, which included children, scrambled the efforts. President KARZAI demanded to withdraw foreign troops from village outposts and return to military camps. It was believed that this would speed up the transition from NATO to the Afghan administration. In June 2013, NATO surrenders command of the remaining 95 districts, and the Afghan forces take the lead in national security. The focus of the U.S.-led coalition moved to military training and counter-terrorism through special operations. The transition took place on the same day that the Taliban and U.S. officials were scheduled to meet for negotiations in Doha, Qatar. President Hamid Karzai suspends talks with the U.S., thinking that the office will provide legitimacy to the rebel organization and function as a diplomatic outpost. To keep a military presence in Afghanistan when his tenure expired in December 2014, Karzai wanted the U.S. administration to negotiate a bilateral security arrangement. In May 2014, Obama declared that the U.S. will withdraw the troops in Afghanistan by the end of 2016. By the end of 2014, the presidential election took place, but after 2 rounds of voting, Ashraf Ghani was elected president of Afghanistan in September. But soon after this, clashes for power began between Ashraf Ghani and his primary competitor, Abdullah. Simultaneously, NATO's military campaign in Afghanistan declared an end to mortal combat, and the U.S. forces stayed to train the Afghan forces. Taking the opportunity of this, the Taliban attacks increased and took control of many security posts. In 2017, as the Taliban attacks increased, the Obama administration changes the decision to completely withdraw the U.S. forces. And around 6,000 U.S. soldiers were said to remain in Afghanistan until the end of Obama's tenure. Later, in 2017, under the Trump administration, military operations continued to prevent a vacuum for terrorists to regain power. In January 2018, there was an upsurge in violence across Afghanistan. Taliban pulled out a series of attacks in Kabul which killed more than 115 people. These assaults were thought to be the reciprocal of President Trump's new military policy of deploying more armed forces in rural Afghanistan to help Afghan battalions and wage airstrikes on opium laboratories to deplete the Taliban's source of funding. Combat between U.S. forces and the Taliban continued for about a year. In February 2019, under the Trump administration, the U.S. and Taliban signed a peace agreement based on releasing the Taliban prisoners and a complete withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan by 2021. The peace agreement was broken by President Trump when a U.S. soldier was killed in a Taliban attack in September 2019. After a year of clashes, in February 2020, a final peace agreement was signed between U.S. envoy Khalilzad and Taliban leader Baradar. The then president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, demanded that the Taliban must oblige to his conditions before getting into any agreements with the U.S. administration. It seemed that no one cared about the civilian casualties and was only worried about their benefits. This agreement didn't propose an immediate ceasefire, and attacks by the Taliban forces continued. In September 2020, leaders of the Taliban and the Afghan government, along with leaders of civil society, meet in Qatar. Afghan administration agrees to the peace talks and releases 5,000 Taliban prisoners. All groups expressed their willingness to bring peace to Afghanistan and establish a constitution for Afghanistan after the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops. By April 2021, only a few U.S. troops were left in Afghanistan. In August 2021, Taliban forces invade Kabul and seize the presidential palace with minimal opposition. Just hours after President Ghani flees the country, it seems as if they were waiting for the U.S. troops to leave. According to the report by Brown University, the U.S. administration has spent $2.3 trillion on the war in Afghanistan during these 20 years from 2001 to 2021. These figures exclude funds that the U.S. government is obligated to spend on long-term care for American war veterans, as well as future interest payments on money borrowed to fund the war. $2.3 trillion means $300 million per day. The average cost of deploying a U.S. soldier abroad is around $785,000. Now, can you imagine how the taxpayers' money was flushed behind these unending wars? These were the on-the-ground costs. Apart from that, the increased unemployment ratio, health care for U.S. citizens, and many other things were compromised for this unfruitful war. To conclude, the US-Afghan War was one of the biggest failures of the U.S. administration. In all these 20 years, they took Afghanistan from the Taliban, lost the lives of soldiers, contractors, and civilians. And at the end of the war, the Taliban take back Afghanistan in just 20 days. Don't you think a secret operation would be far less expensive than this 20 years war? Let us know your opinion about the US-Afghan War in the comments. Hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so that you don't miss out on such interesting topics.